Okay, well, we'll move straight on to Harald. Harald, if you'd like to come up, please. I thought it was a rather fascinating title, actually, so I'm looking forward to this very much. To rewild or not? Is this the question? I think there's a bit of Shakespeare in there.
Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. It's really an honor to speak among you, and it's the first time at ETH, and I'm at ETH since 25 years, that I can speak among trees. You know, this is a really unique opportunity. I have actually been asked to talk about rewilding. This was not my invention to focus on this, and this has the context of the Wildcard project, which is an EU project that is currently ongoing, and we are part of this, and so I'm going to report on some of the results from the Wildcard project, but I will also try to put this into a broader perspective. And, you know, I need to talk a little bit about climate change. Gert-Jan has alluded to that already. I'm going to touch upon a few things that he mentioned, but I'm going to bring in maybe a different perspective once in a while. Then I will focus on the rewilding, and I cannot help putting rewilding in the context of adaptive forest management to handle climate change in the context of food production and the bioeconomy. And then, since we're linking between Integrate and the European Forum for Urban Forests, I would also like to talk a little bit about urban forestry in the face of climate change in the light of the insights from rewilding and adaptive climate change, smart management of forests. So let me start with climate change very briefly, you know, at the risk of teaching or preaching to the choir here. These are some relatively old things from the IPCC. You know, at the top, you see the this is what Gert-Jan mentioned before. Okay. I'm going to be there. Yep. Okay, so this is a relatively old graph from the IPCC about the global mean temperature. And, you know, one of the problems of the IPCC is really dull because every report confirms what the previous report has said already. So you can also use older graphics. They don't change really very much in terms of the contents. And so the major point here is that we are above 1.0 degrees already at the global average. And when you look at a country like Switzerland or mountainous countries in general, we have an increase of plus 2 degrees centigrade since the late 19th century. So we are well above the 2-degree target in Switzerland already in terms of temperature change relative to the pre-industrial. And the other relevant thing here is, you know, when you look at the temperature development of Switzerland over time, you see that after 1980, the thing really started to take off. And this has to do with global dimming that happened after the Second World War with, you know, air pollution actually lowering the signal. And then with the environmental protection laws that came into force in the 1980s, climate change actually started taking off. So we are experiencing now, we have experienced 40 years of human-induced climate change in Switzerland, in mountain regions, and basically in many parts of this globe. And when you put this into a global perspective and a longer-term perspective, and you look at the 2-degree target here, and you look at the worst-case thing, we call that the RCP 8.5 now, the plus 4 degree scenario relative to 1986 to 2005, not relative to pre-industrial. Then you see that if you follow such a route here, and it's not unlikely that we are on that track also for the coming couple of years and decades because of all the political things that are happening now, and nobody cares about climate mitigation anymore. And when you put that into the perspective of the last 800,000 years, here's the plus 4 degree scenario roughly, you see that this is just a Holocene here, the last 20,000 years of human civilization, societies. We are well beyond anything that human societies have ever experienced since they have started to become dependent on ecosystem services being provided by forests. And this is the major point, you know. The forest does not need us, but we need forests for human well-being. And it's not only that changes are gradual over time and they're happening very fast in the coming couple of decades. They have started to change very fast since 1980s, but we also have increasing extreme events. And part of that, as Gert-Jan has mentioned already, is the land use legacy effect with ecosystems, forests becoming older, becoming more susceptible to things like blowdowns, but it's also that the temperature is getting warmer, and the variability of the weather phenomena is increasing, giving rise to higher fire frequency. The temperature increase gives rise to more insect outbreaks, and the variability of the energy in the atmosphere gives rise to increasing windstorms. So it's not only that we can look at averages of climate change and then draw conclusions about whether rewilding is good or not, for example, but we also need to take into account what happens with the increasing variability in weather phenomena. Okay. With that, I'd like to turn to rewilding. And as I said, I've been asked to talk about rewilding here, and I find rewilding a wild or a bewildering concept to start with, because, rewilding means to make wild again, which is assuming that wild is untouched, and so we make ecosystems untouched again, which is an interesting concept. So, we have CO2 increase since pre-industrial times. We have climate change, as I've just explained. We have nitrogen deposition that is acting on all ecosystems except those in the Netherlands, because this is why these forests are so nice. Or perhaps it's the other way around. Anyway, we have land use legacies, that we see the imprint of human impacts on forests. And so rewilding is not to make ecosystems untouched again, but to let ecosystem processes unfold in the absence of direct human intervention. So, rewilding is not making things wild again. That's the bottom line. And then we have this 30 by 30 target, to turn 30 or to establish protection for 30% of the terrestrial and marine ecosystems until the year 2030. And if that is rewilding, and if this was to be untouched, then, well, we have a pretty large challenge. But as a matter of fact, when you look at the EU stipulations, then they say 10%, so 1/3 of these 30%, should be under strict protection. And even the strict protection has lots of exceptions, so something is strictly protected, even if you do some aspects of management, for example, in the sense of, catastrophe or, the disaster prevention, salvage logging, and all kinds of things are still allowed, even though things are strictly protected. So this is not a rewilding target, this is a nature protection or so target, actually. And, in terrestrial ecosystems, in the temperate zone, so in Europe and also in the boreal, rewilding would mean more forest. You abandon agricultural land and you get forest. Or if you do have forest already, the idea is that the forest would probably get darker, at least on the decadal timescale, maybe not in the longer term when successional processes are kicking in. And so in the remainder of my talk, I'm not going to deal with abandonment of agricultural land, because I think this is a interesting idea that gets into trouble with food security and everything. So abandoning agricultural land may not be the best of ideas for a future world. I'm going to talk about releasing forests from management as one aspect of the rewilding. And so you can ask, what are the biodiversity effects of this and what are the carbon effects? And is this something beneficial? And I'm going to deal with the biodiversity effects first and going to get back to a little bit of biodiversity later on. Forest biodiversity. These are data from the Swiss biodiversity monitoring. I apologize for the German titles here, but I have pictures for those who do not understand German, so don't worry. The dark green is the fraction of species that have been found in the Swiss biodiversity monitoring, which is spread across the whole country on a grid. The dark green is forest-dwelling species. The light green is non-forest-dwelling species. And now, forests and biodiversity, are forests good or bad for biodiversity? For mosses, more than 40% of the mosses are forest-dwelling. So forests are good for mosses. For lichens, even better. Nearly 80% of the lichens are forest-dwelling organisms. For the mushrooms, pretty good as well. For the mammals, For the longhorn beetles, yes, forests are also very good. But when you look at ground beetles, most of the ground beetles are found elsewhere, not in forests. You can look at the butterflies. If you want to see butterflies, don't go into a forest. See a dry meadow. And also for flowering plants, it's not really interesting to go into the forest. You should go elsewhere. So, ladies and gentlemen, what do you mean when you say biodiversity. Forests are good for some aspects of biodiversity. Dry meadows are good for other aspects of biodiversity. And so we need to be specific about what we mean with the term biodiversity, which is not a scientific concept, but has actually been invented for science communication to the public. And so, broad statements, brushing statements about biodiversity and forests and blah, 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 blah. I always need to ask, what exactly do you mean? You need to be really specific. And so I find it difficult to talk about biodiversity implications of rewilding in a forest context. Carbon. We have a lot of forest reserves in Switzerland that have been under rewilding since they have been designated as reserves. Most of them are not primeval forests, but have been managed before. And so we can watch rewilding in the forest reserves. We have a network spread across the country, and I'm going to focus on 4 cases here, 4 examples. This is the space in temperature and climate and precipitation that is spanned by these reserves. And you see the 4 examples here. We initialized the model, a model with the first inventory, and then let it run for a couple of decades to see how good the model is in reproducing these observed trajectories of rewilding. And you see for all the 4 examples that I'm showing here, this is basal area, stem number, and this is a species diversity index. So this is a little bit of biodiversity there. The match is pretty good. And when you do that for more than 100 plots, which is what Samuel Zweifel, PhD student in my lab, has been doing in the past months, you see that the basal area observed versus simulated is matching pretty well. Stem numbers are a bit more difficult because stem numbers are so nervous. The stems are coming and going, and the diversity index is matched pretty well. So we can use that model to portray what is happening in a rewilding scenario. And so let's rewild these 4 examples that I've shown before already. This is starting in 2020 and then running for 100 years. Initializing with the last inventory this time. And you see that, on the one hand, when you look at the long-term potential natural vegetation, this is under the current climate, and this is then under 2 RCP scenarios. This potential natural vegetation, basal area, which is a proxy for carbon, this basal area is always higher, much higher than the current state of affairs. That's the first message. The second message is it does take time to get there. Right? So the changes are really slow, and if you want to have a lot of carbon being stored under rewilding scenario, it may take many, many decades. So it's not a short-term solution to mitigate carbon at the global scale. And an important aspect here is in this example, we let the forest rewild further, and the forest decides to collapse because of climate change impacts, drought, whatever. And so, to have more carbon storage in the long term in rewilded forests may be highly problematic because of the risk of the destruction of your sink or your store. Okay. So I'm enthusiastic about all forests and about forest reserves. The forest reserve network is under my responsibility at ETH, but I'm also skeptical about their role in climate mitigation, and so I would not recommend a large-scale rewilding strategy. We are in the rewilding. We are just dealing with the forest as such. But we all know, there's this cascade use of wood until you incinerate the last product that you cannot really recycle anymore or reuse again, and you produce biofuels. So, if you just look at the on-site thing in the forest, the rewilding, we have a change in living tree carbon, which is hopefully positive and hopefully permanent. We have a change in coarse woody debris, so lying dead wood. And we have, in the longer term, also an increase of soil organic carbon, but this is taking really a long time. And as I've mentioned already, the big question of the permanence of these stores is not under our control in a rewilding scenario. It's under the control of climate change and of nature as such. If, however, you consider these off-site effects, the carbon stored in wood products and the substitution of steel and cement, and eventually the use of the carbon as biofuel, that is completely under our control. And people keep saying, well, forget about the 100-year residence time of wood in buildings. But if we had building codes that stipulate that you cannot pull down a building after 60 years because it has been declared to be carbon neutral, which is insane, If we change these rules, then that would also change the residence time of the carbon in our cities. And this is completely under our control, very unlike the rewilding situation. So I'd like to report a little bit on a project that is called Mainwood that deals with trying to balance the different aspects, reserve policy with higher returns in terms of wood production under different scenarios in Switzerland. And this is the project Mainwood. It has lots of different aspects. We are dealing with the forest growth and wood production part, and this is all I'm going to report on today for the sake of time. But we're actually looking at the whole cascade use of wood in several case studies in Switzerland. So our approach is to start with forest management scenarios that we are developing together with the stakeholders. So this is not academically generated, but it's really generated together with the people from the case studies. We are simulating the effect of these management scenarios on forest growth, on ecosystem services, and on aspects of biodiversity under climate change. And then with the results, we will make a large-scale survey among forest managements and the wider public regarding the acceptance and the implications of forest management for the real-world situation. We are considering 4 scenarios, and the exact specification is always dealt with or discussed with the stakeholders in the case study regions. We start from business as usual, where we have a certain amount of close to nature silviculture, which is the prevailing paradigm in Switzerland. You have a certain amount of reserves, and then we also have private forest land, which is often not managed a lot today because labor prices are high in Switzerland, wood prices are low, and so it is really hard to make profit if you are having a forest enterprise in Switzerland today. Then we have an extensification scenario, which we call the bio scenario. We foster biodiversity, having more reserves. And then we go into a hybrid scenario, which is the intensification of wood production, where we actually also install forest plantations, which are forbidden by law in Switzerland today. But the law can be changed if we believe that we need forest plantations. So we just want to try this out. And then we have the strong intensification of wood production, where a lot of plantations are taking place. And of course, in these 2 scenarios, we do not have more reserves than under the current situation. Okay. Now, these are the 5 case studies spread across the major biogeographical regions of Switzerland, and I'm going to report on just one of them today. This is the canton of Vaud, which is representative of the Swiss plateau situation. And here we have 3 elevational belts that we are considering, from very low elevation, drought-adapted species, colline, this is this green, and then the submontane, where beech is dominating, and the lower montane, where beech is dominating as well. We consider species for planting, in this case study, Scots pine, sessile oak, Norway maple, and small-leaved lime. And then we also consider Douglas fir to be planted, although the forest stakeholders in the first round of the discussion said, no, we're not going to plant Douglas fir, but we wanted to try it out in the model setup to see what you can get. And the management patterns, I've mentioned that already, they of course intensify towards the hybrid and the wood scenario, and they extensify towards the bio scenario, and the reserves are never managed. So we are not destroying forest reserves for the sake of the simulation study. Okay, now, just to isolate the effect of climate change without any management at the beginning, and please ignore the elevational indications here, they're wrong. This is the average across each of the elevational belts. It's not one specific site. You see that for the highest elevation, for the lower montane forest, we have a gradual transition into more drought-adapted forest composition, but things look pretty much okay. When you move a little bit further down to the submontane, you see a pretty strong collapse after about 2050 to maybe half of the base layer, half of the carbon storage. And if you go to the lowest elevation, to the colline, then it starts to look really dramatic. So this would be sort of a rewilding of the canton of Vaud under climate change. Not a great perspective. Now, if we go to the 2 intensification scenarios, to the hybrid and then the wood, you see that the harvested wood is on the order of 200,000 and then going down to about 100,000 cubic meters per year being harvested in the entire area. and you can stabilize the basal area at a bit more than 20 square meters per hectare. So this decrease, this loss of carbon can be mitigated by management and by planting of one and several other species, including Douglas fir. When you go to the wood scenario, which is the most extreme, there you have a lot of harvesting at the beginning because we're reducing the basal area, and we are still getting a harvesting level of around 150,000 cubic meters from the silviculture in the near natural forest. And this is the plantations now. We get nearly 100,000 cubic meters per year from the plantations. And when you put that into context of the harvesting that is currently being done, there's one number here from 2015. It's on the order of 100,000 cubic meters per year. So the wood scenario would lead to 100,000 plus 150,000. So this would be increasing the harvesting by a factor of 2.5, in spite of the fact that we have a strong climate change scenario operating here. So this is not the end of harvesting, and this is not the end of the forest as a source of wood, but it's actually, if you do it in a clever way, it is a way into the future, which is much better than following a rewilding or a strong reserve policy strategy. Okay, and then this is very hard to see. It's all green. This is the number of habitat trees per hectare. These are the big trees that we got the question about before. Under the wood scenario, we have some decrease, which is hard to see. Under the bio scenario, we would have a strong increase of the number of habitat trees per hectare. But so even the wood scenario is not the end of habitat trees in the landscape. Okay, and now I'm trying to put these two things, the rewilding and the adaptive forest management, into an urban forestry context. And I start with something that is very fundamental but very important. We all know about it, but I still find that one case study very fascinating. This is from Sebastian Leutzinger in the 2000s. He did that study. This is the city of Basel, and you see here this is the Messe of Basel with a lot of roofs and cemented area. And over here you have something that is pretty green. And if you now fly over this with a thermo camera, then this is what you see in terms of temperatures. You know, here's the Messe Basel with temperatures of around 65 degrees in July 2004, shortly before noon. And over here, you have the brew temperatures, which are about 25 degrees centigrade. So within a very short distance in a city, depending on how much green you have, you can have temperature differences of up to 40 degrees on a summer day. And so this is why trees are very important, and 25% canopy cover is certainly a great idea for the city of Zurich. So, you know, we need green in the cities in a climate change context. Now, I'm switching over to a case study that I was personally involved in the city of Biel, which is 100 kilometers to the west from here. And this is Brück and Modretsch and Met. So, you know, this is a village, and this is the city of Biel. And there's this Langholzwald, which is bordering all these urban areas. And of course, this forest is very, very important for recreation, you know, for joggers and so on, for people who just want to enjoy the forest or have cooler conditions and moisture conditions in summertime. And so the Forest Service planned to do harvesting in part of this, and this is less than 5% of the whole thing, so a small parcel actually, because the forest is dominated by old beeches and spruces, and it would be great to have more deciduous species rather than the spruces, and so doing interventions to adapt this forest to climate change so it will continue to provide cool and moist situations in the future makes perfect sense from the forest management point of view. Now, that's the thing. What happened is that there was fierce resistance against this plan starting in 2022 by an advocacy group that then also landed a couple of articles in the Bieler Tagblatt and elsewhere, you know, for the Swiss. You may have come across that already. And for those who don't read German, it doesn't matter. You know, it made it to the press, and it caused a lot of discussions. this group denied any need for forest management. No, so just leave the forest alone because it's so cool and shady and so nice. We want to keep it the way it is, therefore don't manage it. There were longish discussions with several rounds of experts, including myself, and I was not good enough for them, so they wanted to have better experts anyway. And then there came a solution in January 25, so 3 years later, that the management area was going to be smaller, but they were going to do more frequent management, which the forester told me is probably not going to be a great solution, because if we have the harvesters in the forest all the time, this is going to cause as much resistance as if we have a larger management area. But anyway, that was the solution that was approved or agreed upon also by this advocacy group. And here's the situation in May. As was on the 18th of May, 25. Look at how horrible the forest is looking. We need you. We need to change this. It cannot go on like this. And this was the implementation of the upgraded plan 3 years later. So I would like to put that into a larger context. And I have nothing against the Lechtal in Austria. Don't get me wrong. But I found this on the web, and I find it really intriguing that they're calling for tourists in the Lechtal based on the assumption that you can find the untouched cultural landscape there. Die unberührte Kulturlandschaft, which of course is a contradiction in itself, because either it's a cultural landscape or it's untouched, but it cannot be an untouched cultural landscape. And I think this is exactly the problem of the Langholzwald in Biel, that people think if we do not manage the forest, it will be a wild forest and it will be untouched and it will be the best. Whether that forest, which is composed of beech and spruce, will collapse in 20 years and then we have no forest at all, they don't think that far, because nature as it is, and if it's not touched by us, is best. So, you urban forestry people really have a hard job, The boundary conditions are that we have increasing drought and heat stress in and near cities. We have a high demand for forest services by the urban dwellers. And we have at the same time this demand for untouched nature just around cities. And the issue is that nature does it best from the point of view of the general public. The implication of that is that we have an increasing need for the adaptation of existing green to climate change within cities and in the peri-urban space. And rewilding is not an option from my point of view, because then we will get into trouble with disturbances, with drought-induced forest decline and things like that. But we have a decreasing acceptance of forest management in the peri-urban setting. And so how to solve that is, from my point of view, not a natural science issue. It's not an engineering problem either, but it's simply one of human-nature interactions and communication. And how to you cannot say educate, but how to get the message across that in order to maintain urban green and peri-urban green in a good state, we also need to cut trees. And sometimes we even need to cut big trees because they provide a lot of light. And to get that understanding to people is becoming increasingly difficult, I find. Okay, so here's my take home. Rewilding of forests brings a modest benefit in terms of carbon storage. It brings problems with the persistence of the carbon pools, which are outside our control. Partial biodiversity benefits, but you need to explain what you mean by biodiversity. And of course, my skepticism about rewilding is not an argument against putting things under reserve status, because, this is something that is totally different from the argument about we need to rewild everything. Then targeted climate-adaptive forest management can bring a strong increase of wood production when it's coupled with tree planting. Really, when it's coupled with tree planting. So the idea of leaving everything to natural regeneration is probably not going to work, because nature is not fast enough. And it is particularly interesting to consider plantations on actually a small fraction of land. We consider 10 to 15% of the forest area for plantations. This is not 50% of the forest area. I failed to say that in the case of Vaud. And we can get a lot of wood out of these landscapes. And when it's combined with a reserve policy that takes into account habitat trees and old growth islands, it also has, or it maintains the biodiversity benefits. And lastly, in a peri-urban setting, we have a particularly large need for the adaptation of forests to climate change because of the continuous demand for ecosystem benefits from the population, biophysical ones, aesthetic ones, emotional ones. And this clashes with the desire of the urban dwellers for nature, whatever nature may be. It's not really well defined, but it's being brought out all the time. And so we here really have the problem of the long-term outcomes. What will these green spaces look like in 30 and 50 years from now versus the short-term resistance of a lot of the population to management interventions. And so I wish you a very good conference to discuss about urban forestry. Thank you very much.
Little gift.
Thank you.
And have you had your gift yet?
Yes.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I found that really interesting, actually, and there's a lot of in there. And I think for an audience as diverse as the one that we have here today, that's going to be a discussion, I think, that will run forward. We have time for just one question.
You said
Can you shout it out, please?
Or use the microphone.
Thank you. I was just wondering, what is the underlying reason, because Switzerland has a law against plantations?
Chance to criticize the government here.
I have the microphone. Oh, right. We have a long tradition of uneven age, continuous cover forestry, and this has made its way into the forest law. And there's also an aspect, in the 19th century, there were a lot of erosion problems and flooding problems, and part of them were at least believed, or I think part of them were due to the fact that large-scale clear-cutting had taken place. And so this was banned already in the first forest law of 1876. And I mean, many forests in Switzerland are proud of this, and I think we can be proud of this because it's a better option than to have large-scale clear-cuts.